What happens when Hollywood's most controversial royal sits down with late night's sharpest tongue, only for the conversation to spiral into something no one expected? Tonight, we're breaking down one of the most explosive celebrity interview meltdowns in recent memory, where glossy public personas collided head-on with uncomfortable truths. The result? Late-night television gold that had audiences picking sides within minutes. But before we dive into the chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your theory, because what really happened behind the scenes might be even more revealing than what aired. It all started at Jimmy Kimmel Live. Producers were buzzing with excitement. They'd landed the guest everyone was chasing: Meghan Markle, former working royal, current media lightning rod. Between Hollywood, Buckingham, and everything in between. The ratings were guaranteed, but no one, not even the producers, anticipated just how tense this interview would become. Kimmel entered the stage as he always does, smooth, confident, but sources say he'd done more prep for this one than usual. His team had assembled a dossier, press clippings, prior interviews, public controversies. They knew this guest required something different, a tightrope walk between charm and confrontation. Then came the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle. She stepped out in a sleek navy dress, poised and polished. Her smile was impeccable. That signature wave, flawless. But something about her shoulders just a bit too stiff hinted that this wouldn't be a typical promo spot. "Thanks for being here," Jimmy said. "You know, every time you're on TV, social media goes crazy, lots of opinions, both good and bad. How do you handle all that scrutiny?" On paper, a softball. In practice, there was a faint barb buried in his tone, particularly in the word bad. Meghan's smile tightened. "Well, Jimmy, when you live authentically and speak your truth, there will always be supporters and critics. What matters is staying true to your values." Kimmel nodded, then fired the first real shot. "Right, your truth. That phrase gets thrown around a lot lately. But what about ... the truth? You know, actual facts." The audience stirred, sensing the tone had shifted. Meghan's expression didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of annoyance. Quickly buried. "I think lived experiences are facts," she said calmly. "When someone tells you how they were treated, how they felt, that's their reality. That's not up for debate." "Sure," Jimmy said, "but sometimes perception isn't reality. Like, I perceive myself as incredibly handsome. My wife might disagree." The audience laughed, but it was nervous laughter. The tension had entered the room. Meghan responded, her voice cooler now. "There's a difference between a joke and dismissing someone's lived experience, especially when it involves racism or mistreatment." Jimmy pivoted again, more pointed this time. "Absolutely, racism is real and terrible. But here's the thing: you've shared your experiences, and they've been powerful. But what about others? Staffers, former colleagues, they've shared stories too. Shouldn't their truths matter just as much?" The room went dead. Silent. Meghan sat straighter. The smile was still there, but it had hardened. "What you're referring to are anonymous accusations, never substantiated. And it's interesting that you're choosing to elevate those voices over the one sitting right in front of you." Jimmy didn't back down. "Some of them aren't anonymous anymore. And they're not random tabloid sources either. These are longtime professionals saying they were mistreated. If we're being fair, if we're believing people, don't their experiences count too?" You could feel the audience lean forward. Meghan's team just off stage looked visibly uneasy. She took a breath, then struck back. "Doing right now is exactly the problem. You're drawing a false equivalency between documented racism and weaponized workplace gossip. That's not journalism, that's tabloid theater." "Whoa," Jimmy said, holding up his hands. "I'm not a journalist, I'm a comedian, but I do think it's fair to ask, if you want people to believe your story, shouldn't you be willing to hear the uncomfortable parts of other people's stories too?" The audience held its breath. The interview was no longer an interview. It had become something else, a reckoning, a moment where media polish and real confrontation collided under studio lights. Meghan's composure, usually flawless, was beginning to splinter. The smile she wore so effortlessly was now taut, her voice more clipped, her posture sharper. And yet, Jimmy pressed on, undeterred by the rising tension in the room. "You want to know what's uncomfortable, Jimmy?" Meghan leaned in, her voice low but steely. "It's sitting here while you suggest to national television that I'm a liar. It's having my integrity picked apart under the guise of fair questioning." Jimmy didn't flinch. "Never called you a liar," he said calmly. "I'm asking about consistency. You ask for empathy and understanding, and you deserve that, but when others come forward with different experiences involving you, suddenly those stories become attacks or weapons. I'm just trying to understand how both things can't be true." The air in the studio tightened. It no longer felt like an interview, it felt like a showdown. Meghan straightened, voice dropping into the low, firm register familiar to anyone who'd followed her closely. "Let me be very clear," she said. "The professional staff you're referencing, they were part of a system built to silence me from the beginning. When you're the only person of color in an institution that's never had to confront its own biases, speaking up isn't seen as brave, as being difficult." Jimmy shifted slightly but stayed locked in. "That's what I'm trying to understand. You say it's about race, and I believe you. But some of the people who spoke out had worked with others in your family, people from different backgrounds, and they say the treatment they got from you was different. So how is asking about that unfair?" Meghan's voice cracked slightly, gnawed with weakness. "But frustration. Because you're creating a false equivalency?" she snapped. "You're taking workplace friction, something that happens everywhere, and using it to discredit my experiences with systemic racism. That's exactly how institutions protect themselves, by turning the victim into the problem." Jimmy held her gaze. "Okay, but what if both things are true?" he said carefully. "What if you did face racism, which is wrong, and deserves to be called out, and also some staff had legitimate concerns about your leadership? Why does it have to be either or?" That question hung in the air like a grenade. Meghan's breath caught. You could almost see the internal war between polished poise and raw emotion, because that's not how the real world works. "Jimmy," she said, voice taut, "when you're a woman of color in a position of authority, every decision gets twisted. Every time you speak up for yourself or your team, you're branded demanding. But when a man does it, he's called a strong leader." Jimmy nodded slowly. But he wasn't done. "I get that. I really do. But you had access to the best PR, teams, world-class media training, all the resources anyone could ask for, and you were literally a member of the royal family. So if the issue was management, why not manage differently? Why not fix it instead of walking away?" There was no laughter now, no applause, just silence. The audience sensed they were witnessing something raw and rare, unscripted unraveling. Meghan stared at him, her voice rising for the first time. "You're oversimplifying an incredibly complex situation," she said. "When you're dealing with a centuries-old institution and trying to bring in fresh perspective, there's going to be resistance. The question is whether that institution wants to evolve, or whether it will simply push out anyone who threatens its status quo." Jimmy leaned forward, tone more direct than ever. "But didn't you know what you were walking into?" he asked. "You married into the royal family. You knew the rules, the protocols. None of that was hidden. So why join an institution you fundamentally disagreed with?" For the first time in the interview, Meghan looked genuinely caught off guard. "That's presumptuous," she said after a pause, "to assume I didn't understand what I was joining. There's a huge difference between knowing about tradition and living inside an institution that uses tradition as a shield for prejudice." Jimmy didn't blink. "Okay, but if you discovered racism within the institution, why not work to change it from within? You had a platform, influence, Harry's support. Why was leaving the only option?" Meghan's mask finally cracked. "Because change from within only works when those in power want change," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "When you're constantly being undermined, dismissed, and shut out, eventually you have to ask yourself, is this fight even winnable? Or is my energy better spent elsewhere?" Jimmy nodded, the conversation teetering between revelation and rupture. "Fair enough," he said. "But let me ask you this." Jimmy leaned in, his voice calm but unmistakably pointed. "So let me ask you this. In your Netflix series, your Oprah interview, and other appearances, you've shared your story. You've talked about isolation, about being unsupported even, suicidal. And I think a lot of people felt deep empathy for that." He paused. "But here's what I'm wondering. The Words landed like a punch. Meghan's composure, so meticulously maintained, finally cracked. Her eyes flashed with something between fury and disbelief. "Are you seriously suggesting I should take responsibility for being a victim of racism?" she fired back, her voice sharp as a blade. "Are you asking me to apologize for not handling systemic discrimination with more grace?" Jimmy didn't flinch. "No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm asking about accountability. I'm asking whether it's possible that, in addition to being treated unfairly, there were also legitimate staff concerns issues that had nothing to do with race." "This," Meghan said, rising slightly in her chair, voice tight with emotion, "is exactly the problem. Every time a woman of color speaks up about mistreatment, the focus shifts. Should she apologize? It's gaslighting, Jimmy." "I'm not gaslighting you," he replied calmly. "I'm trying to talk about complexity. Maybe your truth about racism, about isolation is real. But maybe other people's experiences with you are also valid. Acknowledging one doesn't erase the other." Meghan leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "Except it does," she said, "because every time someone validates those complaints, they hand ammunition to the people who want to erase everything I've said. You're feeding the narrative that I was the problem, not the institution." Jimmy paused, weighing his next words carefully. "But what if the goal isn't to erase your experience? What if the goal is to have an honest conversation, one that includes all the uncomfortable truths? What if we can talk about racism and also talk about management without one canceling the other?" Meghan's voice lowered, not in volume, but in wariness. "That's not how the media works anymore," she said, her tone now tinged with fatigue. "Any acknowledgement any nuance gets twisted. Vulnerability becomes instability. Admitting you're not perfect gets weaponized. There's no space for gray anymore, only black and white." The audience was completely still, even the crew. Offstage seemed frozen. Jimmy, aware of the tension but unshaken, made his decision. He pushed forward. "So, let me ask you directly, and I hope you'll answer just as directly. Is it possible that some of the people who worked with you had real concerns about your communication, your management, that had nothing to do with your race or gender?" There was a long pause. Meghan stared at him, her jaw-set expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. "What I think, Jimmy, is that you've spent this entire interview trying to corner me into admitting to some kind of personal failure while brushing past everything I've said about harassment and discrimination. What I think is that you're less interested in a real conversation and more interested in creating a viral moment." But his face shifted. Gone was the playful smirk, replaced by a rare seriousness. "You're right," he said. "I am interested in a viral moment. A moment where someone with your platform finally engages with hard questions instead of sidestepping them. That would be meaningful." The word stung. Meghan's eyes widened. For the first time, she looked stunned when she spoke again. Her voice trembled with fury. "You think I'm deflecting," she said, her tone icy. "I'm trying to explain the lived reality of systemic racism to someone who clearly doesn't want to hear it. You call it deflecting when I point out your bias." Jimmy nodded slowly. "I think," he said carefully, "you've built a public image around being the victim of institutions and people who failed you. But according to multiple people, you weren't just reacting to a system, you were shaping the environment too." And when anyone points out that contradiction, he trailed off. Letting the weight of his words settle in the air, Jimmy leaned forward, his voice low but unmistakably cutting. "You pivot to racism every time, like it explains away every single interpersonal conflict you've ever had." A collective gasp rippled through the studio. The air changed. Several people in the front row sat up straight, their eyes locked on the stage. Even in his most provocative moments, Jimmy had never crossed this line. Meghan slowly rose from her chair, hands trembling. "I can't believe you just said that," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You just reduced every racist attack I've endured every sleepless night. Every moment, I questioned if I belonged to some convenient excuse for bad behavior." Jimmy stood too, tension radiating between them. "I said that experiencing racism doesn't automatically make every criticism invalid. That discrimination and accountability can exist at the same time." Do you hear yourself right now? Meghan's voice rose as she stepped closer to his desk. You're doing what every racist apologist does, saying, sure, racism exists, but maybe the real problem is you. That's textbook gaslighting. And you're doing what people do when they don't want to be questioned. Jimmy shot back, his composure finally cracking. You hide behind identity politics and pretend that any criticism is oppression. The silence that followed felt deafening. Cameras hummed. No one dared to breathe. Meghan's face shifted first shock, then wounded disbelief, and finally something darker. Betrayal. Identity politics, she repeated, slowly. Her voice was quiet, deadly. You just called my experiences of racism identity politics. Do you even hear what you're saying? Jimmy looked like he knew he'd gone too far, but instead of retreating, he doubled down. I'm saying not. Every workplace issue is about discrimination. At some point, you have to ask if any of it had to do with you, with how you led, how you treated people. Meghan shook her head in disbelief. You want to talk about personal responsibility? She said, voice rising again. Personal responsibility is standing up when you're being mistreated, Evan. If it costs you your reputation, it's walking away from a system designed to break you on, refusing to break. Jimmy didn't hesitate. If people felt scared to speak up or experienced toxic management, that reflects leadership too, not just the system you were in. Meghan let out a bitter laugh. You want to talk about the environment I created? I created one that demanded professionalism, that challenged outdated norms, that insisted on equal respect for everyone, regardless of background. If that made people uncomfortable, then yes, I take responsibility. Proudly. Jimmy's tone sharpened. What about the environment where staff felt silenced, where people said they were shouted at, where turnover was abnormally high? Meghan locked eyes with him, allegedly according to people who never went on record. According to sources who had every reason to undermine me. You're giving weight to rumors and whispers while brushing aside documented discrimination. Jimmy didn't flinch. The harassment you faced was wrong, he said, no question. But that doesn't mean every staff complaint was a lie. Both things can be true. Meghan's voice rose with finality. No, Jimmy, they can't both be true the way you're framing them. Because when you put anonymous accusations on the same level as public, provable racism, you're not being neutral or being complicit. You're doing exactly what the system wants you to do. Discredit the person calling it out. Jimmy stepped closer, his tone now cold and deliberate. Or maybe, he said, I'm just trying to have the kind of honest conversation nobody else is willing to have with you. Maybe I'm treating you like an adult one who can handle tough questions instead of some fragile symbol who has to be protected from criticism. The insult was sharp, calculated, and Meghan felt it. Meghan's face flushed a deep, furious red. When she spoke, her voice shook not with fear, but with rage. Fragile victim, she spat. You think calling out racism makes me fragile? You think standing up for myself for others makes me a victim? No, Jimmy. You know what makes someone fragile? Being so rattled by a woman of color speaking her truth that you spend an entire interview trying to tear her down. Jimmy held his ground, but his voice faltered. I'm not trying to tear you down. I'm trying to understand how someone with your education, your platform, your resources always ends up in situations where everyone else is the problem. That was it, Meghan snapped. She tore off her microphone and slammed it onto the chair. The clack of plastic against fabric echoed across the studio like a gavel. You know what, Jimmy? This conversation is over. The words rang out like a verdict. I came here expecting a dialogue, a real conversation with someone who understood nuance, who respected the complexity of these issues. Instead, I find myself on trial, interrogated by a man who clearly made up his mind before I even walked on stage. She turned toward the edge of the set, heels clicking sharply. The audience sat in stunned, breathless silence. Jimmy stood, trying to salvage anything, Meghan. Wait. I think we're having a conversation that matters. Isn't it worth finishing? She stopped mid-step, spun around. Her eyes were blazing. Important? You think this is important? You've spent the last 20 minutes trying to bait me into apologizing for being the victim. You've dismissed my trauma, minimized my lived experience, and somehow twisted it into a story where I am to blame. And you call that important television. Jimmy's voice was smaller now, the confidence visibly draining. "I think honest conversations about complicated issues are important." Meghan laughed, but there was nothing light in it. There was nothing honest about what you did here tonight. You used your platform not to inform, not to challenge, but to invalidate. You turned your desk into a pulpit for the same tired, harmful narratives that made me walk away from public life in the first place. And in doing so, you proved exactly why people like me. She paused. The phrase hung, "Can't trust. People like you." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others watched, riveted, like witnesses to something they knew would be played on loop for weeks. Jimmy's voice was barely a whisper now. People like me. People who call themselves balanced while perpetuating bias. People who pretend to ask questions but come armed with verdicts. People who can't listen without twisting what's being said into something that fits their narrative. She picked up her purse and turned once more toward the exit. Jimmy took a final shot. "Meghan, I really hope you'll reconsider. I think there's more here to talk about." She paused at the very edge of the stage, her silhouette backlit. She turned one final time. "You're right, there is more to talk about, but not with you, and not like this. Because what you did here tonight wasn't journalism, it wasn't dialogue, it was an ambush. And I'm done letting people like you weaponize my story." And with that, Meghan Markle walked off the stage. Jimmy stood frozen behind his desk. The audience remained utterly silent. The cameras, still rolling, panned slowly across a room that no longer felt like entertainment but aftermath. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. What was billed as a light-hearted celebrity sit-down had detonated into one of the most controversial interviews in late-night history. A clash of ideologies, a collision of narratives, and a moment that would be debated, dissected, and replayed for months, if not years, to public figures, to truths, and no middle ground.